I first just want to acknowledge that sexual harassment and assault can be really difficult topics for many of us. So if this is something that's especially painful for you or triggering in any way, please feel free to step out of the room. Like, I won't be offended. So a couple years ago, I was working for a labor union. And I was at a conference watching a football game at a bar with a couple colleagues who I'd only ever worked with remotely. The president of one of my union's local affiliates was also there. Not 5 minutes after meeting me, this guy decided that he wanted to make a bet about the football game, and the loser would have to take off an item of clothing. I was wearing a dress, so like one item of clothing. I fumbled some awkward answer and I changed the subject, but I felt like crying. The guy laughed, my coworkers laughed, and they all just kept watching the game. And everything about my body language should have signaled my discomfort to anyone who was paying the slightest bit of attention, even people who didn't know me. I kept trying to move away from him. I gave one-word answers, and in an instant, I had gone from my normal gregarious laughter to being really shy and withdrawn. But if they had noticed, nobody I was with thought to ask if I was okay. A few minutes later, that guy proposed this bet again. Loser takes off an item of clothing. I said outright that it was inappropriate, but my coworkers just laughed again. So I just walked out of the bar. And as I was leaving, they were still laughing together and ordering another round. In that moment, I watched my colleagues prioritize this man's amusement over my well-being and over my inclusion in what had been, up to that point, discussions about my job and my work. Back in my hotel room, I considered whether I should report it. I hadn't been working there for really long at that point, and I had actually already filed a complaint after a manager had called me sexy to a room full of people while introducing me. And if I filed another complaint, I then ran the risk of being considered too squeaky of a wheel and not having my contract renewed. And beyond that, this man was the president of one of our locals. So who would the organization care about or protect more? Like an elected affiliate leader or me? So I called room service. I ordered myself a remarkably good brownie sundae and decided that I wouldn't bother reporting it. But I also decided in that moment to avoid those two colleagues. By laughing while I was humiliated, those guys had told me that I was not safe with them. They'd also totally screwed up the work that we were doing together because I just couldn't bear to work with them anymore. While sitting in that hotel room, I felt so alone. But of course, I really wasn't. According to the EEOC, 60 to 75% of women report experiencing sexual harassment at work, even if they don't necessarily label it as such. And please remember, though that statistic specifically speaks directly to the experiences of women, this is not just an issue of men harassing women. People of all identities may be victims of or perpetrators of sexual or gender-based harassment. And how that harassment occurs or is experienced, it depends a lot on our identities, including gender, but also race, sexuality, disability, age, immigration status. Workplace harassment of all kinds has similar consequences. The EEOC tells us that employees experiencing sexual harassment are more likely to report symptoms of depression, general stress and anxiety, post-traumatic stress disorder, and overall impaired psychological well-being. They experience lowered self-esteem, disordered eating, headaches, cardiovascular issues, musculoskeletal problems. They get angry, they don't sleep well, and they develop problems in their other relationships. Experiencing harassment, or even just being a witness to harassment, leads to decreased productivity, job dissatisfaction, work withdrawal, team disunity. People who experience harassment leave their jobs, or they get fired because their productivity and their work product suffer. They leave the industry that they've been in altogether, trying to find somewhere to work that will just make them feel safe and respected. Think of all the talent that we're losing. By choosing the comfort and amusement of people who harass or abuse, or even just make the occasional off-color joke, over the safety and well-being of the rest of our people, especially women, especially non-binary people, especially queer folks, especially people of color. By not prioritizing those talented people in our workplaces and in our lives and in our industries, we are harming them. And we are worse off politically, financially, in whatever way we want to measure it. We are worse off when we lose that talent. If all the panels and articles and stories and speeches about why addressing sexual harassment is the right thing to do can't convince you to take this seriously, then maybe the business case will. Sexual harassment means you are regularly losing institutional knowledge because people are exiting your companies. Your programs and projects stall, your team's morale plummets, the turnover and the constant departures of women or of people of color hurt your reputation. And so I am begging you to take this problem seriously. Not just to check a box, but to put in the real work that it takes to create change. Our systems have been failing the people who are targets of harassment. Some people see that they're able to misbehave with impunity, while others see that their own brilliance and contributions just aren't valued. The choice to let abusive behavior slide is just that. It's a choice. Sexual harassment is a systemic problem, but it starts with individual choices, which also means that dismantling it starts with individual choices. I actually have a poster on my wall at home with a quote from JFK, and it says, "One person can make a difference and everyone should try." So I'd like you to start that process with me right here in this room. Now, what I'm about to propose may seem a little counterintuitive. I've just spent the last 7 or so minutes telling you how much of a problem sexual and gender-based harassment is. I'm on the stage at a conference talking about it. So you rightly probably assume that I think sexual harassment's a big deal. But what if we acted like it's not? And so that's my proposal, is let's just decide together that sexual harassment's not a big deal. Now, I don't mean the harassment itself, of course, but if we collectively lower the bar for intervention, treating addressing sexual harassment as if it isn't a big deal, we can build more inclusive, welcoming, and safe workplaces. When someone makes an inappropriate comment and nobody pushes back, that person learns what they can get away with. And they push it a little further next time, and a little further the next. And over time, they learn that people will overlook their violence because they also might bring some good ideas to the table. But when we lower the bar, when we interrupt or report harassment the first time it happens, and when our companies and peers make clear that disrupting this behavior early on is a priority, we collectively send a message to observers and abusers alike that this will not be tolerated. Right now, reporting sexual harassment in your workplace is a huge deal. People agonize over whether to tell anyone, who to tell, whether their employer will take it seriously. But if we choose to speak up earlier and more often, tackling this problem can feel so much more manageable. Think of a time when you witnessed someone say or do something inappropriate. Your friend was being way too persistent with someone at a bar. Someone asked an incredibly intrusive question about your queer coworker's sexuality. That time someone called their boss a bitch. But you didn't say anything, and neither did anyone else. Did something trigger in your mind in that moment that something was wrong? Our instinct most of the time is to minimize it, even subconsciously, so that we don't have to deal with it. He was laughing, so he must not have minded that joke at his expense. Or she hugged him when she left, so obviously she couldn't have been that uncomfortable. And I get it, you don't want to be a buzzkill, and you don't want to create a conflict or make it into like a whole thing. And I've made that choice too, plenty of times. But what if instead of letting it go, you had said, "Hey man, that's not cool," or "We don't talk about people like that here." In that split second where you have chosen not making a scene, instead of showing up for the person on the other end of that harassment, you've telegraphed who you really care about versus who is expendable. Treating sexual harassment like it isn't a big deal means that we create workplace cultures that talk about it, that address it head on, and that lower barriers. So think back to that time when you didn't speak up. What would have happened if you'd gone up to the target of that harassment afterwards and said, "Hey, I heard what you said back there. Are you okay? I'll come with you to report it if you want." Could you have prevented the person who made that joke from hurting others in the future by stopping into her office to say, I get you that you meant it as a joke, but it wasn't funny? Can you understand why that made them uncomfortable? This doesn't have to feel like a burden, but it should always feel like it is our responsibility. Every time that we witness or hear about harassment or those unwelcome comments is an opportunity for us to step into our values. We hear a lot about how people value inclusivity. If you truly value inclusivity, prove it. Once you've identified someone who is abusive or has harassed others or is just simply a bully, you also need to remove them. When you see that people like that are included in a space, look around and see who's not. Individual interactions are important, but they are not going to get us all the way to dismantling this problem. It's a multifaceted issue that is deeply entrenched throughout all levels of every institution we have. And so for those of you in the room who are leaders in your community or who are funders, the choices you make must go beyond one-on-one interventions. Your voice and your choices have the most potential to create the systemic change that we need. And without you, frankly, none of this will work. Research has shown that all the training and reporting systems in the world won't work if employees don't believe that the organization's leaders truly care about harassment. Your buy-in matters. When you say you're committed, but then all you offer your staff is a short online PowerPoint that teaches them nothing more than the legal definition with some outdated and unrelatable scenarios, you're telling them that this really is not that important to you. You're signaling that sexual harassment isn't a big deal, but in a bad way. Signaling that sexual harassment isn't a big deal in a good way looks like empowering people to speak up. It looks like investing in real, comprehensive, interactive training for every single person in your organization, from your board chair, to your CEO, to your managers, to your staff, to your interns. It looks like overhauling your policies so they do more than cover your ass in the event of a lawsuit. It looks like crafting policies that instead positively assert that every employee has the right to a safe working environment and tells people that they will be supported in coming forward. And it looks like building processes and procedures so that everyone knows who they can report to, what an investigation looks like, what kinds of consequences someone might face, how work will be reassigned in a way that does not burden the person who experienced the harassment, how you're going to handle it when the harasser is a client or a donor, how the wishes of the person coming forward will be respected. Making sexual harassment not a big deal also means ending your own institutional and personal complicity in putting up barriers to safety. Complicity can come from malice, absolutely. But it can also come from simply not having the tools to know how to handle this. And I want you to have those tools, to know how to deal with this. I started Works in Progress 2 years ago after seeing institutions in the progressive movement fail time and again to really do this work to live up to our values. There are more people doing this work than ever before in the wake of the Me Too movement. I promise there are people around to help you do this. And as leaders, all you have to do is choose to prioritize it. None of this is possible, however, without fully reckoning with past misdeeds. You cannot just wave your hands over past wrongdoing or issue feckless apologies and statements and then just move on to this path forward. You do owe those people that you have been failing an apology. But please do not confuse an apology for accountability. An apology is a starting point. When stories come out, including the ones about this very community, in this very room, people make apologies, but they also make excuses. Sabrina Hersey-Issa wrote a marvelous piece on Me Too and civic tech, laying out a path forward for leaders in this space, and I encourage you all to go read it on Medium. And I want to quote Sabrina now. Accountability is a literal providing an account of your actions, not a rationalization or an excuse, but a deeply honest explanation that is based in fully taking responsibility for your actions and inactions and the impact of your actions and inactions. Apology calls for responsibility, an offer to meaningfully address the harm, and to make the space to explore what possible healing could look like. There are people and institutions in this room who need to reckon with the harm that they have done and the choices that you have collectively made to stand by and elevate the voices and careers of abusers at the expense of talented, brilliant women. You need to create space for healing and for building trust. And so I encourage you all to do extensive audits of your own organizations and professional networks with professionals who can guide you through taking real responsibility for your roles in the institutional failures that have led to this conference deciding that it needed a main stage talk on the subject. And please note, I do say professionals. This is work that you should be paying people for. Please, please stop making it the job of your women friends and colleagues to put your pieces back together. Lastly, and I know I'm pretty much over time, to the people in this room who have suffered personally and professionally because of a harasser's actions or anyone else's choice to ignore them, I want to just say, I see you. For those of you who have spoken out publicly, including Sarah, thank you for your courage. For those of you who have held these experiences in, none of what happened to you is less important simply because an article has not been written about it. We are in a huge moment of opportunity right now to make change. And so I am calling on each of you here to do this work. We can all, together, and each one of us, make the choice to stop tolerating sexual and gender-based harassment and act accordingly every single day. I really can't wait to build a beautiful and safe future with all of you. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Robyn. Thank God I put on the waterproof mascara today. So we're going to go to some Q&A, and we know that in the afternoon there's going to be a workshop where we go through some of these issues. Robyn and also a colleague, friend of hers, Stephen Hicks, will be working through this, so we really invite you to attend. It's in, I think, it's in the program. Okay, so shall we start from the questions in Slido?
Yeah.
How do we address and dismantle harmful norms and stereotypes around gender, sexual orientation, and race? Some of these stereotypes are the foundations for some of this violence. So how do you do that in some of your work and training? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, all of this is an intersectional problem. When I speak about this being a, gender-based harassment problem, people are not only their gender, they are also all of the other identities that they show up with. And so all of this work needs to take place at once. I know lots of folks are doing work around racial equity work in their workplace, but I've heard from some women of color who then work in those places. This addressed the race part of things, of my identity, but not the gender part. And the sexual harassment work addresses my gender piece of things, but not my racial identity. All of this goes together. It all has to be one piece of the work, right? There's no separating it. We're not only one thing at a time.
No, it's real. Intersectional work here is really key. I think the next top question is something that a lot of folks in this room can relate to. So much emotional labor goes into the mere report of a sexual assault or harassment that you really have to do a lot on this end to even get to that point. So where is the work? How can we redistribute it a little bit to make it easier for those folks who are going through that really difficult emotional time? I know that you went through some of this in your discussion today, in your talk, but whose work and responsibility is it? The person who causes the harm? No, right?
Yeah, I mean, it is absolutely the work and responsibility of the people who caused harm and the people who were complicit in that, who didn't follow up properly, who ultimately fumbled the reporting process around it, to make that right. There is, unfortunately, sort of inherently some labor that tends to be necessary and required of the person who was harmed, just because sometimes you have to give voice to the fact that that happened in the first place for people to know. I would love to see all of it shift to the people who did harm. But I think that there's a couple pieces. One is about how are you rectifying things and how are you making things right with the individual person you harmed, and how are you making things right with the community? Looking at a community like this, like PDF, thinking about all the people who are not here because they were here in previous years and felt alienated, had awful things said to or about them within this conference or elsewhere in their professional networks. It is absolutely the work of people who caused harm to make things right with that individual, but also with the community. And so I see another question up here about, what is the what's the mechanism outside of this for reporting? All of that comes hand in hand, right? Like all of this has to be work that people are doing to build systems to make things right.
Yeah. And I know something that we've been talking about both at PDF and throughout the larger civic tech community is how can we maybe build an independent body or something that is outside of our organizations. We're such a distributed community.
Yeah.
And so many of us are working for each other, working on someone else's organization, bopping over to another. And I was just talking to Sherry Hakimi last night about this, but that independent ombudsperson is one of the most effective ways of reporting and keeping those reports like an escrow service. So I know that there are some apps out there that are doing that, but I would challenge or rather offer the opportunity to the audience when you go to Robyn's workshop and also afterwards, how we as a community can build an effective tool or use a tool that's already out there. I know there's one exists. My mind is blanking right now on the name of it, but how can we actually use that within our community and put it to work? I think it's a really big question, and I hope that you address it this afternoon in the workshop as well.
Yeah, it's absolutely something that I'm part of conversations all the time about how do we build this, and I think there's so many independent things people are trying to do. And so if that's something that you are working on or interested in working on, please come find me and chat about it. Because I think that we all want to build this and find the right way to build it in a way that provides accountability, provides some measure of safety, and takes away the chance for people to really screw up the response within an individual organization. But it's a hard problem. I want to know how to solve it too.
Well, I know we're at time. I personally want to thank you, Robyn, for coming here. And I know Mika, Andrew, and myself were all really committed to helping solve and make progress on this really important issue. So thank you so much.